You know, I love sports, I love business, but this podcast episode specifically is really important to me because outside of the podcast world, leadership is one of my favorite topics. It's one of my favorite passions. I always strive to be a better leader, whether it's as a basketball coach, a father, a husband, church leader, or even in the business world. And so today, Pete Steinberg, who is a former U.S. women's rugby coach, who has coached some of the most elite athletes in the sport of rugby, is joining us because he also is a leadership coach. And he has a book called Leadership Shock, which I am in the process at the time of this recording. I'm in the process of reading it, and it's incredible. It's so many amazing concepts and new terminology for me, and it's caused me to do a lot of self-reflection, which you'll hear about here in the interview. But man, oh man, he has so much insight to leadership, and he explains some of his models that he talks to the executives about in their businesses and helps people overcome leadership shocks so they can be more effective as leaders to help the rest of their team maximize their potential. It's insane. You're going to hear stories from his rugby days. We're going to hear stories of his corporate days and what he's doing to help in the corporate sector. So if you guys enjoy leadership and you guys enjoy sports, you're going to want to tap into this one. This is the Gametime Guru. So, what time is it? Game time! Woo! This is the Gametime Guru podcast, where I interview sports figures from all over the world to help deliver a panoramic view on sports. So whether you're a former athlete, one of the crazies, or simply a casual sports fan, this is the perfect show for you as we peel back the curtains and learn from our guests every single week. I'm your host, Shane Larson, and I'm helping you see sports through a different lens. What's up, everyone? Welcome out to another episode of the Gametime Guru podcast. Shane Larson here, host of the show. Excited to be here with you guys. As you heard in the introduction, very special episode for a variety of reasons for me in my own personal life right now. But just the whole reason I started this show in 2017 was because, as you guys know, I always hated how people called athletes dumb jocks. And there was I had my sister who thought we were all dumb, and they thought there was no parallels between sports and business and leadership and so forth. But our guest today has pretty much debunked that with his own experiences and what he's currently doing now. The book that we're going to be talking about that he has just published and getting out to the masses here. And I'm just more I can't even explain how excited I am. So if you guys enjoy this, which I know you will, please hit me with that follow. I'm trying to build a YouTube platform, but all the other listeners that are in the 182 countries that this has been downloaded in, make sure to hit me with that subscribe button on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you wish, please give us a 5-star review and let us know what you like from the interview. But joining me is the man, the myth, the legend. His name is Pete Steinberg. Pete, thanks for joining the show, man.
Shane, so excited to be here and chat to you today.
Oh, man. The feeling is mutual, man. We're talking about the book called Leadership Shock, but I'm literally in shock that I'm talking to you because it's just so, I told you right before we started recording, it's just such a perfect timing in my personal life right now that I'm talking about this book. But, Pete, as we get into talking about the book, I wanted to make sure, I mentioned in the introduction, your background in rugby. I wanted to touch base on that so people understand just how deep into the sport you are as a leader. Obviously, you've coached championship rugby programs. I want to just ask you a quick question on that. What is the biggest thing that rugby has taught you from a leadership perspective as a coach, not necessarily as a player, but as a coach? What was the biggest thing you learned from coaching these high-level females in the sport of rugby?
Well, Shane, I'm going to tell you something, and I actually, I talk about this with the executives that I work with. But when I was at here is a picture of the 2014 Women's Rugby World Cup that I coached at. And when I coached at that 2014 World Cup and here at the Rio Olympics and at the 2017 World Cup, I sat in the stands and the players had to play. I think, despite my accent, my dad's American, I'm a proud US citizen. Rugby is a player-centered sport. There's actually not much that you can do when the game happens when you're the coach. You're not on the field. You're talking to the physios, trying to get the players to do stuff. You talk to the physios talk to the players. The players can ignore you. They can do whatever they want, right? You get 10 minutes at halftime and that's it. So I think the thing that makes rugby a little bit different as a sport, as a coach, and the reason why I think this translates into leadership in business is that you literally have to prepare the players to be a great team under pressure, make decisions, recover from mistakes, all by themselves. You're not on the field with them. You can't help them. And I think that's why rugby is such a great analogy for leadership in business, because great leaders can't be involved in the day-to-day. They have to create the culture and the environment and the team that can run the business on that day-to-day so they can think big picture strategy. So I think that's the biggest thing that rugby has taught me, is how to build that culture and how to let go of that decision-making responsibility and that delegation process.
Wow, that is huge. Okay, that's all right at the beginning of the interview. I would encourage everybody listening, rewind that. Like, I know a lot of people who listen to this, they're sports fans. They want to learn a little bit about that, but they're also working their full-time jobs. There's plenty of leaders in the corporate world and the sports world that are listening to this right now. Rewind that, because now I'm sure we'll get into the weeds here a little bit more, Pete. But the thing is, it's easier said than done to, like, when you're used to being in the processes and procedures type of person in the corporate world, it's hard to let off a little bit. Same in the sports world. You're used to being the athlete.
Yeah.
I do as a coach. I'm like used to playing, but like having to take a step back and have a hands-off approach. It's easier said than done. So that's where, like, I'm excited to learn more about, like, the stuff. And that's why Leadership Shock, this book, is so awesome, because it's actually applicable information. It's not just word vomit from a leader. It's legitimately, like, applicable information that you can apply to your current role. So I love that about that. So thank you for sharing. And I might ask you another question at the end of the interview, just about your rugby, like, because obviously 2014, 2017, there's some big stuff there, and people are going to be like, well, I want to hear more about that, but we got some stuff to unpack. So I want to talk about in your book and in your coaching from a corporate leadership standpoint. You talk about the authentic leadership model, and I want to talk about that. What is the authentic leadership model? Can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure, Shane. And I'm actually going to relate this back to my sports experience, because I'm on the Gametime Guru, right? So that's
I love it.
That's how it's going to be different, right? So in sports, as a coach, you need a system. You need to think about the way you get your team to perform in a system. And it starts with things like, what are we trying to accomplish? Like, what are the big things actually, in my mind, it starts with, how is the game played? Right, currently, it's different if I'm coaching basketball in the NBA than if I'm coaching basketball in high school, right? It's a different game. So how is the game played? And then what are the strengths and opportunities that my team has to be able to win within the game that's being played? And then you create this sort of thing called a game model, which is like, what's the game that we can win at, right? The way that we want to play. And that's a system. And I learned that as a coach, that, like, the best way to win is not to play like another team. Like in rugby, you look at New Zealand. New Zealand is the best team in the world. Guess what? We're never going to beat New Zealand if we play like New Zealand. They're going to do it better, right? They've been playing the game since they're 4, right? They've got natural skills. We can't beat them at their game, but we're Americans. We have powerful, particularly in the women's game, powerful female athletes. We can play a different game, and that can be the game that can help us win. And that explicit model, that was literally the foundation of my thinking around the authentic leadership model, which is leaders are in the same space, right? They're in this space where there's a game that's happening, right? Their business is happening, their context is happening, but most leaders don't have a game model. They don't have a system that says, how am I trying to win? What am I trying to accomplish? And that's really what the authentic leadership model, it's a connection of 5 different pieces that, when put together, help leaders decide where they want to spend their time. So what is their focus and priorities, and how do they want to lead? And those are the 2 outcomes of the authentic leadership model.
I love that. Now, trying to implement that, let's just say you're a leader that, and I'm a firm believer that any executive leader, whether they're at a corporate office or let's just even say on the the sports arena, right? Whether it's rugby, it's football, it's basketball, it's soccer, whatever it is. But let's shift over to the corporate world here. Some leaders are kind of what we would say set in their ways, right? But I believe that leaders should be, like, consistently learning. And that's part of the reason I love this book, is it's like, it's showing you those things so you can have a little self-awareness and then have the willingness to change. But let's just say a leader is reading your book for the first time and they're learning about this authentic leadership model, But what are the barriers for leaders to start building their own authentic leadership model? Like what are those barriers that they're going to run into? Because I'm sure that this is a foreign concept to some that might be set in their ways, and they're not used to this particular concept.
Well, I mean, I think you're really touching, Shane, on the fundamentals of the book, which is called Leadership Shock, right? So leadership shock is actually something that I kept coming across. I didn't realize it. I've been coaching. I mean, coaching athletes and coaching executives is very similar. And so for about 15 years, I did both at the same time. And I kept coming across the same symptoms of leaders, right? So I would, a client would come to me and say, hey, can you come and work with this leader? And their calendar would be like crazy, and their team would be confused, and the leader was surviving, but they weren't thriving. They were in what I realized was this consistent thing called leadership shock, and it's actually designed for people that challenge that change is a challenge, right? If you're willing to change because you've got a new role and you're very open to that, you often won't come into leadership shock, because you're willing to fill the role that's different. But people that are successful often keep their leadership approach from their previous role. So what they do is that they're a director of marketing, and they become the VP of marketing. And they're like, okay, I was really successful as the director of marketing. I'm going to be the same leader that I am as the VP of marketing. But actually, because the role is so different, the way that you lead it has to change. So there's a couple of things. This is sort of Shane. I also teach at Penn State in the business school. So one of the problems is when you ask a question, you always get too much information. That's kind of like the professor in me. So why is this difficult? The biggest challenge that most leaders have is they just don't have time. In fact, if you're in leadership shock, one of the symptoms is you don't have any time. And to get out of leadership shock, you have to create time. So taking time to stop and reflect and be intentional. And in fact, Shane, this is something, again, relating it back to sports. I recently took a group of managing directors from United Airlines to the elite athlete training site, training stadium in Chula Vista, where the US women's Olympic team is training for Paris in the Olympics. And I got to take 30 of these leaders from United Airlines there, and they were just blown away by what it is to be an Olympian. And one of the things that it is to be an Olympian is it's all about intentionality. There isn't a moment that a coach or a player wastes when they are training and when they are not training. They are absolutely intentional about what they do. And the trick about being a great leader and following the authentic leadership model is the willingness to let go of past behaviors and be intentional, just like you would if you were an elite athlete. Like, what am I trying to do right now? Therefore, how should I lead and how should I behave to get to that outcome? So I think letting go of past behaviors is a challenge. I think finding time is a challenge. And the last thing that I would say, there's a couple of bits of the model that I think in particular are challenging when people go through it. So one is the value that I provide, which is a model. So that there's 5 parts of the model. It starts with purpose, like what's your purpose, what fills your emotional tank. It has what's the vision that you're trying to fulfill, and what are you trying to accomplish in this role? What's the expectation the organization has? What's the value that you provide in this role, and what your leadership beliefs? Purpose, discovery process, people can get to that, I think, pretty well. Vision, most people have some version of that. I know what I want to do. Role expectation, they might need to test that with different stakeholders, but people often get that. But the 2 hardest parts are the value that I provide in this role. And the reason why, and leadership beliefs. The value I provide is hard because it's not the value I provided before. It's not what made me good in my previous role. It's what makes me good in this role, and that's hard. And leadership beliefs are difficult because people actually don't know why they believe something. And so you have to be something called metacognitive. You have to think about why you think something. And so leadership beliefs is sort of like, hey, I think collaborate or empowerment is really important. Okay, why? Why is empowerment important? Because the belief that empowerment is important isn't enough. Understanding why you think it's important is really, really critical. So I think understanding the value that you provide in a new role is hard. And I think really delving in to why, your leadership beliefs are what they are, those are probably the two hardest things for people to get to.
And I can't really judge people for this at all, though, because, I've worked for some executives that, are struggling with this. I'm sure they might not know the terminology leadership shock yet, but they will soon
Right.
as this comes out. But, I'm thinking as you're talking, Pete, it's the whole metacognition concept. It's true. Like maybe like I've worked for executives. I'm trying to put this into words where maybe they're like, in a world now where remote working is so common, work from home and stuff, we went through the COVID era. And so there's still some people that are like, well, no, we have to work in the office. It has to be here. Well, why? And I don't know if they've ever actually questioned that, because I'm like, I'll be honest, I'm quite more efficient at home than I ever was in the office. And I did a deep analysis of that. And I was like, man, I do more in 4 hours of work than I used to do in 8 sitting in an office. And
right.
I think it's just because of the distractions in the office. But they always used to say, like, I've worked for executives that are like, well, no, proximity is power. Well, is it really, or is that just what you were told back in that? And maybe it is, but it's just questioning those things to understand the why. Make sure you understand the reason you believe them. That is a really cool. Like, I'm sure it's hard because there's a pride and an ego that go into certain things, and
completely. Yeah, and it's hard. Like metacognition is really hard. In fact, this is again going back because it's the Gametime guru. The way I think about metacognition in sport is that that's what data analytics gives you. Right. So when you work with an athlete, they're like, in rugby, I'm a great tackler. I'm like, are you? Let's go look at the data. Right. The data will tell us if you're a great like it's forced on you. That feedback loop and that reflective piece is forced on you as an athlete because it's driven by data. But in business, we don't have that. So someone can have a belief that this is important, like being in the office is important. And even when you show the data, Shane, that's like, actually, it reduces my productivity, because they're not used to having data challenge the way that they think, it becomes static, right? It becomes a belief that is fixed and cannot change. And any leader that has beliefs that are fixed that cannot change are not leaders that are going to be long-term successful, because the world is too dynamic. Like COVID's a great example. Like, we have to be in the office. Do we have to be in the office? And now we're coming out of COVID. I think you need to be in the office if there's a reason for you to be in the office, right? Like there has to be a purpose for you to go into the office. This is way beyond Gametime Guru, I think, and beyond Leadership Shock. But as leaders, we have to recognize that we have to challenge our beliefs. And if we have data that allows us to do that, we have to be open to changing our views.
No, I really appreciate that. I love the insight. And, Pete, in the book, you talk about this as part of like the leadership shock. There was a part in this book that you discuss how sometimes going, like, as you just talked about earlier too, like going from a director of marketing to a VP of marketing or whatever it might be in your role at your current company, as compared to maybe you go to a different company in a different industry. I liken that to like maybe playing on a team, you're a star on this team, but then maybe you transfer schools because your parents move or whatever it may be, right? And you have a different team, different culture and so forth. But you mentioned something that I thought was interesting in the book. Maybe I could have you elaborate, but it was like, sometimes it's easier for leaders to go to a different company because they cross their T's, dot their I's sort of thing. They kind of cross-check everything, even if it's a completely different industry, but going to a different company in an executive role as compared to, like you said, like promoting from a director to a VP, maybe in your current company, because you tend to take your skill sets and your leadership traits that you have there and think they can be directly applied into that. And it doesn't always work. And so you get kind of swallowed up in that. Do you mind, maybe expanding upon why you think it's easier, or could potentially be an easier transition to go to something different rather than within your own company that you're currently at?
Yeah, this was actually an insight by Maria Taylor, who's the Chief Learning Officer at United, and I've done a lot of work with Maria. But it makes sense. So sometimes when we get promoted, and by the way, when we talk about leadership shock, like this can happen at like your very first role as a manager, right? Your very first role as a manager. The book is written for the people that aren't in the C-suite. In the C-suite, you get support. Right, you get a coach, like they help you on the transition, but your first manager role or your first director role, that's actually a real challenge. And so Maria really talked about, look, people get promoted and the next day they come into the same desk, right? They have the same computer, they have the same email, they know everyone. Like the fact that it feels the same means that you're less open to change. When you go to a new company and everything is new, you're like, oh, it's all new. Your assumption is things have to change. And so I think when you're promoted within the company, you kind of have a confidence and a belief that, yeah, I can do this job. I've done this job. I've worked here for a while. When you go to a new company, there's sort of this sense that you have to prove yourself with all these new people that you've never worked with before. And so you actually try a lot harder to be a better leader in that new company because you feel like you have to prove yourself. And so I think there is a little bit of so it might be the star, but it might just be like, I'm going to go play on a new team. And on that team, no one knows me. And it's like my first practice. Like I can't drop the ball 5 times. Everyone's going to be like, that guy can't catch. They don't know anything about me. I mean, there's a whole bunch of really interesting science around trust and trustworthiness that plays in here. But like it literally, when you go to a new company, you're so driven to do well that you're open to new things. And when you're promoted from within, both confidence and the lack of change that happens around you can create that full sense of security that, yeah, I can do this. I've done it before. And you forget that your role is different. The expectations are different. Everything around you has changed. The value that you provide is different. And so that makes it really contextual and it makes it really hard for you to change.
I love that. Thank you for elaborating on that. I think that's so cool and so insightful for all of us to be aware, because it actually totally made sense when I was reading the basic rundown of it. But like that, and I think everybody else would say that right as you said that, you're like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense.
Right.
But we didn't realize it at the time. Sometimes you need someone to say it before you realize. You're like, yeah, dude, he's totally making sense there. Here's a question I've got for you, Pete. You've worked with some top level executives and a ton of different types of leadership. And you've worked with high level athletes. I mean, high level athletes in those sports. I mean, in rugby, I mean, it's as high as it gets as far as the elite athleticism and skill set. What are some of the parallels? I want to share with people some of the parallels between your top executive leaders in the corporate world compared to top like elite athletes, and see if there's any parallels between sports and business.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the answer is yes, there is. One of the interesting things is when I took the United Airline managing directors to the Olympic training site. I mean, one of the things about the Olympics, which is, which not many people get the insight, is that people, give up their careers and they pursue the Olympic dream. And if you don't win a gold medal, you're not making a lot of money, right? That's kind of like, that's basically it. And so the women that train for the Olympics on the women's rugby team in Chula Vista, they don't get paid much. And there's a woman there that graduated from Harvard in microbiology. There's another woman there that has a degree from Princeton and a law degree from Harvard. And all of their peers, right, that they're competing against have houses, great jobs. And, these women in front of the United folks were like, I don't have any experience. I've been doing this for 10 years. Who's going to hire me? And pretty much all of the United MDs were like, I would hire you. Because what they have that actually I don't think senior executives have is they have really elite teaming skills. They actually know how to work together in a team at a level that business does not teach you. Right. And so I think there's sort of the teaming thing that happens in elite sport that we overlook. It's all the intangibles. It's the leadership and teaming stuff that makes those athletes special. But there are absolute parallels between athletes that get to the elite level and executives that get to the elite level. And it's things like passion, right? You got to love it. Like if you don't love it, you're not going to be good at it. That's why the authentic leadership model starts with purpose. It's like, what do you really love doing? Right. And so having passion, I think is important. Being committed to growth, being committed to being better. Like one of the things I like to say is that the way you make the Olympic team when you come into a camp is not by being the best player at the camp, but by being the player at the camp that improves the most. Because no player that comes into an Olympic camp is going to be good enough to make the Olympics, right? Like you're not on the team yet. You're trying to make the team. What you do is you come in and you look for the people that can improve. And I think that's true for the best executives that I've worked with. They've been open to growth and they've been open to change. And then I believe there needs to be a support structure. And this is actually somewhere that business really falls down, is that they don't put elite performance support structures around their executives, right? There's no rest. There's no recovery. There's no balance. There's no nutrition. There's no mental skill support, right? All these things that elite athletes need to be at their absolute best don't happen in business. So I think the attributes, the personality attributes are the same. The passion, the commitment to growth. I think there's an intentionality that happens there, that where I said they're both very intentional about what they want to do in their careers. They're very goal oriented. But I think one of the things that business does not do but should do, and I think we're getting there with some of the mental wellness stuff that's happening, is that you really, if you want your top performers in your organization to be at their best, you need to create an infrastructure that supports their performance for the long term. That happens at the elite athlete level, but it does not happen at the elite business level.
That is so true. And again, Pete, you're sharing this stuff and I'm like, oh yeah, like it doesn't happen in the business world, and that it needs to more often. Man, this is crazy. So it actually like stemmed another question. What I do is usually I have my phone on me, and if I get questions, this is what I always encourage people to do, Pete. So if you guys are listening to this, always pull up your notepad on your device and take notes. So one of the questions that I had on here was circling back when you just said this to the poverty of time from a lot of leaders. Ooh. Okay. So you're talking about, you mentioned just like a lot of leaders get promoted and then they don't have a lot of time. And the whole point of this authentic leadership model and just everything that you're talking about, it's like you need more time. And then you were just talking about how we don't have a lot of rest and recovery and all the little things on that front so they're just like overwhelmed with a lot of stuff, and it's just go, 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 go. And some people are built for that, but I think everybody, even if you're quote unquote built for that, will burn out at some point. Yep. Right. And so my question for you, after having worked with these leaders, both in sports, but mainly in business in this particular discussion, how do you help them free up time and not have such a poverty of time? Because they're so used to having their hands on with everything, and they think that everything's important. You even wrote this in the books, like they think that they have to have these meetings, or they're just so used to it. How do you like help them shift their psychological viewpoint of it all, of like, no, you're going to be okay. Just delegate that to somebody else. Like, is it really that important? I'm just curious how you've seen some success stories there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point. And by the way, I've never heard the term poverty of time, but I'm now going to steal it. So I think that's a great term, Shane. I love it. Like there's a time desert, right? We just don't have enough of it. It's really interesting because I work, you hear a lot of leaders, they'll talk about their organization and we say, we're only as good as our people. And I'm like, that's insufficient. We're only as good as our people and where they spend their time. Right? Time is the most valuable asset of a leader, and it is a non-renewable resource. Once I spend it, it is gone. And I don't think leaders actually value their time effectively. I don't think they understand that the impact of time or how they leverage their time has such an impact on their ability to succeed. And I think we have sort of a little bit of a warped sense of time. So like, I always like to give the example with my clients. I'm like, if a vendor calls you today and says, hey, they want to meet next week, what would you say? And they're like, oh, I'm really busy next week, I can't meet them. But if they say, oh, I want to meet 2 months from now, you look at your calendar and you're like, oh, yeah, I have time 2 months from now. And I'm like, hold on. Is that hour that you're giving the vendor 2 months from now worth less than the hour next week? If you're not willing to put this meeting on your calendar next week, why are you willing to put it on your calendar 2 months from now? It's still an hour. It should be valued the same way, but we discount it. And so what happens is that 2 months from now, that week's crazy. And now you have this meeting that isn't actually valuable enough. So the first thing that we do is we really get clients to think about time as being valuable. And then the second thing that we do is we say, look at your calendar. When you look at your calendar, there are really three things on your calendar. There are things that you can't control. Organizational meetings, your boss puts time on your calendar. Like there are just things that aren't under your control. That's, a third of your calendar is that. A third of your calendar is things that you need to be at. You actually need to be at because you can make a difference at that meeting. And then another third, and these aren't exact, it's not really a third and a third, it's 3 different types of meetings. The third type of meeting are meetings that you really have to question whether you need to be at. Are you actually going to make an impact? And I worked with a guy called Jeff Tanner, and Jeff is now the CEO of Simply Good Foods. They had Atkins and Quest. And I was working with another client, and Jeff manages, like, he's ruthless about his time. So I was working with another C-suite executive, and he was really struggling. So I gave Jeff a call and I said, I know you do this well. Tell me how you decide if you're going to be in a meeting. And Jeff said, if it's not going to move the stock price, it's not worth my time. It is not worth my time to be in a meeting to make an idea 2% better. Right? And yet we always think it's worth our time to make things a little bit better. When you're a senior executive, that isn't where you should be spending your time. You should be spending on the time where you can maximize the impact. And so helping people understand their time is valuable, and then helping them understand, or helping them think through these meetings to say, am I actually making an impact at this meeting? If I wasn't in this meeting, would the meeting be okay? Yeah. It might even be better if you're not in the meeting, right? So you have to literally go through that. And I talk about this in the book. Like, when you first start with executives, they have no, like, the worst thing is they're like, oh, I'm in leadership shock. And you're like, great, let's meet. And they're like, oh, I can't meet with you because I have no time. Okay. So we have to be very tactical. And so we take a shotgun to their calendar. We go through and we're like, is there an impact? If you're not in this meeting, will it fail? No. Okay. You're out of that meeting. Okay. We're out of that meeting. Every week you have to do that. Eventually, when you come out of the other end of the leadership shock work and the authentic leadership model, you actually can be more intentional about, okay, here's where I want to spend my time. Here's where I don't need to spend my time as much. And you can manage your calendar proactively. But at the start, it's absolutely reactive. And we're just trying to find some time in the calendar to meet.
Man, so that's where you talk about the shotgun approach. Then you're literally taking a shotgun to it.
Taking a shotgun to the calendar. Just start shooting holes in your calendar, right? Don't need to be in that meeting. Do you have to meet with this person right now? No, then push it off, right? You just have to find time. And to your point, Shane, that really has, I think, our lack of discipline about how we use our time as leaders has a big impact on our sustainability and our ability to be at our best when our organization requires us to do that. I think that's a big lesson that leaders get when they go to the Olympic training site in Chula Vista, is the athletes talk about how important recovery is, how important getting away from rugby is for them so they can be at their best when they're doing rugby. And I think for a lot of leaders, that's a real struggle.
Man, and just out of curiosity, Pete, with this whole thing, I can just imagine taking a shotgun to a calendar. This is a foreign concept to some of these leaders. This is obviously why you're coaching them on it. From your experience, how long would you say it takes them to become comfortable with freeing this up? Because I'm sure it's like a couple weeks here, maybe it's a month or 2, 3. I don't know. What would you say? So the other leaders who are listening to this right now might be like, okay, I might be uncomfortable for a couple of weeks, but it seems like it's working for most people after we get comfortable with it.
Yeah, it takes people a few weeks because it actually takes them a little bit of time to think through which of these meetings they should get rid of, right? And then once you're in that system, you're like, oh yeah, it's one of those meetings. I don't need to be in it. But I will tell you, Shane, that I've had a couple of clients who actually that you show them the first time and they're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. They love taking their shotgun to the calendar. They're like, bang, 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 bang. They just do it immediately. For whatever reason, it just and then they'll be like, why have I not done this for the last 20 years? Right. It's it's how do I create hygiene, calendar hygiene? How do I get rid of the dirt, the things that clog up my time? Right. And for some people, it just comes naturally. But for most people, it takes a couple of weeks. And by then you're actually removing recurring meetings. Right. So you say, hey, I don't need to be in this meeting anymore. And that meeting happens every week. Boom, that's gone, right? And then you have to be really intentional about it. To me, it's how you accept meetings. I mean, I work with clients and they're like, oh, I'm triple booked. I'm like, so you accepted 3 meetings? How can you be triple booked? So then you become really disciplined about the meetings that you accept, what you allow on your calendar. So after you've created that space, then you have to protect that space by being really intentional about what you allow on that space.
Wow, man. All of this makes sense though, because it's almost like it's Tetris. It starts to put into place, but
it's exactly Tetris. Yeah.
Start this way
completely
to help you in the other ways, and then it all fits together. Man, this is actually really cool, Pete. I'm curious though, do you typically or do you ever experience people who say, no, I'm good, I already know this, like a COO, for example, or somebody who's a direct, I don't know, but like who says, nah, I'm good, like I already know what I'm doing, I don't have the time to like even look at this, and they choose not to take a look into having a coach or something of that nature?
Yeah, I mean, it happens sometimes. Like, I mean, it kind of depends how you get brought in. So, if the executive reaches out to me and says, I'm struggling, I need your help, that's easy. They already know that they've got a problem. The challenge is when the organization or their leader tells them, you need help, go meet with Pete.
Gotcha.
And then I have to have a really honest conversation. And I made the mistake. I've made the mistake early on in my career when I was like, oh, I can fix everyone. Right? I can help anyone grow. But actually they need to grow. And they need to want to do it. And so I actually have a very honest sit down with a leader and said, look, I've been asked to come in and work with you. Here's how I work. You want to go on this journey? And be honest. If you don't want to go on the journey, I'm not the right fit, tell me, because I don't want to waste your time and my time. And one time I had someone said, yeah, I want to go on the journey. And then they didn't. And the way that you know that they didn't is that they don't find time to meet with you. So you have a couple of meetings with them, and then it goes like weeks, and they don't find time to meet with you. And you're like, all right, this is someone that other things are more important than them. And there's not a judgment there, right? It's just a matter of fact. And at that point, you just reach out and say, hey, look, no problem. Let's pause this or cancel this contract. And you just reach out whenever you can. And I actually think that's a really, really important role of the coach, of an executive coach, is to hold the leader accountable, to not let them get away with putting in 50% effort. The same way that's the role of the sports coach, right? Your job as an executive coach is to maximize the potential of the leader. The same way when you're coaching a sport is to maximize the potential of the athletes. It's exactly the same. And so you need to sit down and I did this as a coach, coaching rugby, both at Penn State and at the national team level, where you sit there and be like, look, I don't see the effort. Do you want to be here? Do you really want to be here? Let's have an honest conversation, because you're not acting like you want to be here. And that's exactly the same conversation you would have with a leader in that situation.
You know what's so funny, Pete, is I was about literally what I was thinking of was coaching in athletics. As a basketball coach myself, that's one of the things I've talked to other coaches, and they say, you can't coach effort, right? So that's, and unfortunately, and the whole, the phrase you said, you can't save them all, basically, is what I've been told. So it's like, you can't help everyone. I've had people say you can't save them all, which is hard, because as leaders, you want to do that, but you literally have to your goal is to help influence them to understand that it's up to them to really put in the effort, and then you can work together. But if they're not willing to do that, athletes are the same way, like you just said. It's so hard, though. It's so hard.
It is so hard. Yeah. And when I coached, I would always say, I'm here for the difficult athletes, not the easy ones.
Ooh.
That's what I'm here for, right? Like the easy athletes, they're going to be good and they're going to have great lives because they've got all the things that you would want as a coach. The difficult athletes, the ones that aren't fulfilling their potential, you could have a life-changing opportunity with them, both in the sport but beyond. Get them to understand how important commitment is, getting them to understand what it is to be part of a team. Those are life skills. And so those difficult athletes, and you don't get to all of them, but if you get to some, right, that's worth it to me. And you have to balance, I had a question, I do some plenary, some speaking, and I had a question at a talk I gave recently where someone was like, what do you do with an athlete that doesn't follow the values of the team? And I said, well, I actually like to differentiate. There's the difficult athlete, They may not follow the values of the team, but actually they could. And there's the disruptive athlete. The disruptive athlete affects others, right? So they're not following the values of the team, but they're affecting others' ability to perform. The difficult athlete is the one that isn't following the values of the team, but they're not affecting others. Like it's just something, like you have to unlock something there. I think that the disruptive athlete is really like, that's the one that you ask to leave because they're going to affect others. But the difficult athlete, not being disruptive, that's someone you can still work with. And I feel like that's the same in business. So often, I get called in. I mean, the funny thing about Leadership Shock is that my next book in my head, I haven't written it yet, is called Team Shock, because what actually happens mostly with my clients is I get asked by a client to come in and say, my team's not performing very well. It's not performing at its best. Can you come help? And I kind of talk to all the team members and I do an assessment. And 90% of the time, it's because the leader's in leadership shock. And I'm like, oh, okay, hold on. Now I know what's happening is that your team isn't effective because you're not leading effectively. Right. And so that's like, which is a hard conversation to have, right? Sort of like, hey, it's your fault. I mean, there's ways to get around that. But that's actually, that team dynamic piece is one of the important outcomes of the authentic leadership model, because it helps leaders be really explicit about how they want to lead their teams.
Wow, man, this is so good. All of this is phenomenal. I'm just like, I got so many things spinning around in my head. And there's so many questions that I have, but I want to just kind of touch base then. Like, we talk about the disruptive versus the normal ones. Like, are they disruptive? Okay, you ask them to leave. It's just, I'm just thinking for myself as a coach as well. But I guess my question here would also be, let's take it back to the sports world. Think about one of the leaders that you've coached, one of those athletes they're not the difficult athlete. Maybe they were the difficult athlete, but you coached them. They're a good leader. What stood out? Who were they, and what stood out to you about them specifically on what they did to pull up others, as well as taking ownership and accountability for their own stuff and their own growth, like you were talking about earlier?
Wow. Okay. So there's a woman right now who coaches Penn State called Kate Daly. And Kate is also an assistant on the women's national team. And Kate was a multiple All-American and won multiple national championships when I coached her at Penn State. And Kate was one of those difficult for me to coach athletes. And the reason why it was difficult for me to coach Kate is Kate was very outcome focused as a player. So what she wanted to do, she wanted to win. And that's great and that's fine. But to her, she didn't understand as a player that it's the process that gets you to winning. Right? So you have great, like, it's really, I mean, and honestly, in sports, I can't control if we win. I can control how good the team is and how good we are. And so at Penn State, we, that was our focus. Our focus was on excellence. Right. And just like, we're going to be the best team that we can be. And so I remember it was 2008. We had won the national championship in 2007. And we had lost it in 2008, and we were setting our goals for the year. And Kate wanted winning the national championship to be a goal. And I said, we can't do that. We actually we can't control that. So we can't set a goal that we don't control. And we actually, in front of the whole team, we could call it a discussion, but it was probably an argument. and so anyway, we didn't put winning on there. We put it around our processes and excellence and things like that. And we went on and won the 2009 national championship. And now if you talk to Kate, she goes through the same process of goal setting with the team. And now she won't let her team put winning on their goals because she now understands it's not actually about winning. I would say that one of the best teams I ever coached was the 2006 women's team. And for Penn State, and we lost to Stanford in the final in a very close game. So for people that don't know rugby, it's the ancestor of football. So, if you want to be really interesting at dinner parties, the reason it's called a touchdown is in rugby, you have to touch the ball down to score in the try zone. If you don't touch it down, it's not a score. At some point, the Americans said, hey, we're not going to, you don't have to touch it down, but we'll call it a touchdown. So that's why it's called a touchdown. So rugby's the ancestor of football, so the scoring's the same. So we lost in 2005 to Stanford by 40 points. So it's a blowout. Like they completely beat us. In 2006, we lost to them, I think, 15-12. And they scored like in the last 2 minutes. So we closed a 40-point gap. That year, that 2006 year was like they were as good as they could be. We just weren't as good as Stanford. They had a player called Jess Watkins, phenomenal, played for the US. Shane, listen to this, went on to be an astronaut. Okay. Crazy. Yeah. By the way, the second women's rugby player who's played for the US that's been an astronaut. I'm not sure there's another sport that can say that. But so Jess Watkins, a phenomenal player, just better than anyone that we had. And she was like a difference maker. But we played as well as we could play. That 2006 team is probably the team that maximized its potential as much as it could, but didn't win. And that's okay, because our goals weren't to win. Our goal was to maximize our potential.
Ooh, man, this is so cool. And you've referenced a couple, like you were talking about Harvard grads, astronauts. I mean, at the beginning of this, I was talking about, man, like, you guys think that athletes are dumb jocks? Yeah.
Yeah.
I would highly encourage you guys to listen to this interview again, then, if that's the case. Holy cow. And you yourself, P, we're talking about all this stuff. You as an athlete, as a coach, as a leadership coach, everything, man, holy cow. So if I'm a leader at a company and I want to read this book, Leadership Shock, what would you, Pete, as the author and the brains behind everything with all of your experience, what should I expect to get out of this book? Because I know you're talking about, coaching, but I want to read this book. Just reading the book, what can I get out of it? And then maybe if I wanted to learn more, I can go and contact you and see if I can utilize you for your services. But what can I get out of the book by the time I end up finishing it?
Yeah, so the book's been designed to help any leader that wants to get out of leadership shock and be more intentional. So there is both in the book, there's a narrative, right? And it's sort of like an amalgamation of lots of leaders I've worked with. But at the end of each chapter, there's an explanation and a little bit like, hey, if you want to do this step of the model, here are some questions that you can consider. And I think that a leader that's really committed will be able to build their own authentic leadership model from that. And so I think what you should get is, like, the narrative itself, I think, is pretty compelling. Like, people want to find out about this leader called Michael, who just became CEO of a pharmaceutical company. So you get to read the narrative. But at the end of each of the chapters, you also get to apply what you heard Michael go through, and you actually get a chance to sort of practice and sort of stop and reflect. So I think we have that there. There's also a Leadership Shock podcast series, where I have clients and experts, former clients and experts, that talk about their experience. So that's definitely another way to do that. And if you go to petesteinberg.com, you can sign up for my newsletter. We have a lot of information that comes out about the authentic leadership model that will help you as well.
Oh man, okay. I love it. I'm going to put all the links here in the description, Pete, for everybody to be able to find your website, your consulting website, and everything from Innovative Thought and all that. I want them to see the book too, because I'm going to encourage everybody to read the book. I was talking to Pete before this. I'm currently, at the time of this recording, still reading it. I have not completed it, but one thing you said was reflection. It has caused me, I'm talking maybe an hour and a half's worth of reading so far. Self-reflection. That has been such a big piece of it. And that's when I know a book is good, right? Like, there's books that people read or they write, and then you're reading it and you just kind of go through it, and it's cool and all. But like, this one has caused me to stop and reflect, which, it takes longer to read the book that way, but it's a good thing because it's shifting my mindset. And I'm encouraging anybody who takes leadership seriously. Like, reflection's a big piece for me. And you mentioned that just a second ago. And I'm like, dude, that is so spot on. It'll help you, self-reflect. Now, as we wrap up the interview, Pete, I've had such a good time chatting with you, but you have so much experience, like, from the sports world too. But one thing I never asked you, and I just want to kind of get your take on it because I'm in the media myself, is commentary. Like, you got the experience on the media side too, man. And I just kind of want to know what's like one of the favorite memories you've had from a commentating perspective, which is probably random, but I just want to know.
Yeah, no. So I I used to commentate a lot. Now I commentate a little bit for Major League Rugby, which is the professional rugby league in the US. And so I've done some things in Fox and CBS Sports. So the thing that I loved about I love about commentating is it keeps me in the sport.
Yeah.
And the thing that I particularly love, and I think it's something I'm particularly good at, is I love explaining the game to people that don't understand it. Because the game of rugby, it's not natural to the Americans, right? The Americans didn't grow up. It's like the Rugby World Cup on the men's side. It's the third most watched sporting event in the world. You would never know that in America. And so when you're commentating, what you want to do is you want the casual fan, the person that's like scrolling through and they see this weird game happening on Fox Sports, and you're like, oh, this is rugby. I heard about rugby. Isn't that football without pads? Right? That's normally like the first reaction. And so having someone reach out to me and tell me, hey, you helped me understand something about the sport in your commentary is the thing that really again fills my emotional tank. But I will say that one of my favorite rugby commentating experiences was in the first year of Major League Rugby. It was a semi-final game between Seattle and San Diego in San Diego. And it was just this amazing game of rugby. Like when you're a commentator and the game is good, it is easy. Like the game carries you through the show because things are happening that are exciting. If it's a blowout or it's a bad game, it's tough. It's really tough. You got to find things to talk about, right? Like that isn't like, oh, this is a really terrible game. The players are playing terribly. Like the weather's terrible, or this is a blowout. Now, like the game's over. There's 20 minutes to go. What are we going to talk about? Kind of stuff. But when the game is great, which this one was, and it finished on the last play of the game in the corner. It was just a moment. And because it was the first year of Major League Rugby, it felt like a little bit of a coming out. Like there was like 5,000 people in the stands. It was like the crowd was going crazy. It just felt like an actual moment where you're like, this rugby thing might work in America. And it was very cool to be part of that.
Oh, I'm sure it was, man. That's super cool. It's interesting you mentioned MLR because I had Matt working. He actually played for, I think, New Orleans in their first season. It was the inaugural season of the MLR here. And I had him on my show when it launched. It's been 5, 6 years, 7 years ago, something to that effect. And so I paid attention to it. And what's cool that you mentioned, Pete, for the casual fan. So when I interviewed him, I was like, man, I got to learn more about rugby. I have a lot of friends who actually play in it. I had some that served church missions in Australia and New Zealand. And so they came home back to America. And then I was like, oh my goodness, like, this is pretty cool, but I don't understand the rules. But as soon I watched a YouTube video before I interviewed Matt Workin, and all it took was like 20 minutes of me like taking a deep dive and understanding the rules, and I became obsessed with it. So I actually love rugby.
That's awesome.
As soon as you understand the game, it doesn't look like it's so confusing anymore. It's like actually pretty simple, but people just get confused with the scrums and everything that's going on. But once you understand it, it is so cool. And I love to see the growth of it in the United States. It's getting there. It's bigger. It'll take a little while.
2031, Shane. 2031, the Rugby World Cup is coming to America.
Are you going to be there? Are you going to be commentating for it? What are we
I would love to commentate. I might be like, there are people that are going to be more committed to commentating than I am. I love it, but it's hard for me because I travel for work. So it's hard to commentate. But there's definitely, like 2031, it's going to be here. I'm going to be involved one way or the other because it's going to be a big deal. A big deal.
Heck yeah. I'm looking forward to hearing your voice somewhere, where however that's applicable for that, then I'm going to be hearing it. So Pete, I've got so if somebody wants to take advantage of your services, obviously we have the book, PeteSteinberg.com/book. We've got that. So if they want to purchase your book, and see what you've written, that's awesome. But if they want to take advantage of your consulting services and kind of see what packages you have available, is that innovative-thought.com? Am I
it is. You have that exactly right. You have that exactly right. I'm going to make sure and always, and find me on LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn as well. Yeah, that's another good spot for leaders because you'll see I post pretty regularly on LinkedIn, like thought leadership pieces, but that's another good place to connect with me.
Heck yeah. So I'm going to put all these descriptions, like I said, in the description of the podcast, all these links, I should say, And then make sure you reference the LinkedIn one. There is the consulting webpage and the book. Obviously, go check them all out if you want to, but if that's what you guys are wanting to reference, you don't know which one means what, that's what you guys should be doing. And Pete, I just want to say thank you for your time, man. I've had a blast chatting with you and learning. This is the coolest thing about like doing this show is I get to learn from people like you. It's almost like I got to pinch myself sometimes, but it's just a massive blessing and an honor. So I just want to say thanks for joining the show, man.
Hey, Shane, this has been a great discussion. Loved it. Absolutely loved it. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, man. For those who are listening, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button and follow us because we'll be coming to you next week with another interview. Take care. Guys, thanks so much for listening to another episode of my show. Now, if you could go and do me a favor, head over to iTunes, give me 5 stars, and leave me a review. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks, guys. Appreciate your support.